Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today and to participate in this particular session of the Ceres conference on unlocking innovation, the business case for empowering women. I have to say that having just heard an incredible woman receive an award for her long-time work with many of you, I don't think I need to say any more. Just look at the Sister Pat and the innovation and the political and social and motivating skills that she was able to show. You may notice that I have a little arm problem. I can offer a little bit of wisdom. I'm a very proud Irish grandmother, but I've just realized that grandchildren can be a hazard. I was playing with 4 grandchildren in the sunshine in County Mayo on Easter Sunday, waiting to go and look for the Easter eggs. And a ball came towards me that I actually should have let go, but you know, pride comes before a fall, and Granny lurched and bang, and so I have an arm in a sling for a little while, but it's well on the mend. I'm particularly keen on this issue because I do see a trend towards companies realizing that diversity is part of sustainability. And so I think we're talking about an issue that is coming into its own, and yet there's still a lot of work to be done. I'd like to begin by just speaking briefly about the example that I learned from politics. I was fortunate enough to be elected to the Irish Senate from the university constituency of Trinity College, which was one of the 2 university streams that could elect 3 senators. So that was 6 senators out of the 60 were elected by the university graduates, and that's still the case. And I challenged the status quo that it was elderly male professors in 1969, and was elected at the age of 25 to the Senate, and took my place among 5 other women out of the 60 senators. And we really didn't have much impact. We didn't figure really on the legislative agenda. But when the number went up to 13 a few years later, then we began to determine priorities and put a different focus and raise issues that otherwise weren't being raised. And I learned the importance of critical mass in ensuring that there would be change and there would be more balance. And I've come to support personally use of quotas to get more political mass in politics. Some people don't like quotas. In fact, some women who achieve positions in political life often feel that this would somehow undermine what they were doing, but I don't agree. I think we have to get to a situation of having that critical mass and that balance, and then we don't perhaps need quotas. They don't have to be there forever, but I think they have a very important role. And I very strongly believe that there's a need to look at the business case not as 1 or 2 women on a board, but as a critical mass right through the company, and gender equality right through the company. And that the potential of that and the value to that is that it will influence the strategic thinking. It will influence working with different stakeholders that corporations need to do, and in a more complex world, assessing risk, trying to estimate consumer preferences or indeed consumer reactions, and having the alternative viewpoints and concerns about the culture of the company, the way in which it operates as a global citizen in communities, particularly in the developing world. And so I think there's a case that is increasingly being recognized, that diversity is not only to be valued, but is in fact a core to sustainability. But the playing field, as we know, is not yet an equal one. Many of you will have read the article by Anne-Marie Slaughter, where she pointed out that, in effect, women in current circumstances can't have it all. I think she was slightly misunderstood, and I've heard her speak more recently in London, and she's making the very strong case for changes to be made that remove some of the barriers and inhibitions to women being able to continue in corporate or other structures so that they take on the leadership roles. But there's no doubt that if business wants to benefit from diversity, wants to gain from the innovation and the thinking, then it has to be worked on consciously and at all levels and measured and be a goal set that is visibly delivered and held to. Obviously, women's leadership is going to be all the more necessary for the reasons that I was very glad to hear you were encouraged to think about this morning in a disruptive way, which I fully support. The fact that we are in an extraordinary era of needing transformative change and transformative leadership. I have to say that I tend now, in my mind, to make a comparison between that period of 1944 and 1945 and 2014, 2015. In 1944, and we're just about to mark in Normandy, the Normandy landings and the 100th anniversary of the First World War, there was such a consciousness of the mistakes that had been made. Mistakes after the First World War, which laid the seeds for a Second World War. The massive deaths, the incredible trauma for the world, the Holocaust, the opening up of a Cold War. And what happened in 1945? Look at the range of decisions that were come to in an extraordinary spirit of human solidarity. The Charter of the United Nations, the Marshall Plan for Europe, the Bretton Woods institutions for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and a few years later, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just an extraordinary sense of a solidarity of purpose and the financial commitment, the structures, the institutions. In 2014, 2015, we are in the same order of magnitude of challenge. We have to do two hugely important steps for the future of humanity, and we have to do them well. First of all, we have to adopt Sustainable Development Goals, which will be in September of next year. And there's an intergovernmental panel, which you know, working on that at the moment. And secondly, we have to have a fair, robust climate agreement by December 2015 in Paris. And those two big decisions between them have to set us on a different course than the course we're on at the moment, towards staying below 2 degrees Celsius. And we're going to need the kind of leadership that I do see in the climate world from women taking the responsibility, which they either are doing because it's their job, as in the case of Christiana Figueres. I know Christiana was supposed to address you, and we work very closely together, and I admire hugely her leadership and the way that she uses all her skills of leadership, from her ability to work well with governments, to cajole and encourage them to do more than they might have done, to work with a wide circle of business, of civil society, of faith-based. She's reaching out young people, and she uses Twitter, she uses all social media to do that. And she does it with a passion that's very much part of her own makeup. But there's another woman who I find interesting because it wasn't so obvious that she would turn to climate, but she has. And that is Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF. I'm really very interested to see how seriously she links the world of the finance ministers with their responsibility to address climate change. She has warned against the danger of finance ministers and the financial community focusing on the short-term issues. She has pointed out that there is a need to look to the long term. And speaking about climate change, and I quote her, she said, "Climate change transcends time. It's a short-term issue, it's a medium-term issue, and it's a long-term issue." And if we don't deal with it in the short term, it will come to haunt us, our children and our grandchildren. I think it's an issue that we have to address constantly. It's something that we have to have constantly, not on the back, but on the front of our minds. And she encourages finance ministers to get the pricing right, and the fiscal policy, the tax, the climate tax, and to gradually phase out and remove subsidies from fossil fuels, and to play a role as finance ministers. And I think the importance of that is, for too long, climate was for environment ministers and to a certain extent energy ministers, and it was a separate issue. But in fact, it's about development, it's about politics, it's about the future of the planet. Another woman who, again, didn't necessarily have to get into the climate from her position, but has in a very interesting way, is Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the ITUC. And I know Sharon well because she is involved in a high-level advisory committee to our climate justice dialogue that my foundation has with the World Resources Institute. And she's the most senior trade union woman in the world, and she's giving a leadership that's quite extraordinary. And she's doing it because she talks about the fight against climate change as a generation fight, and that if we're to protect the next generation from poverty, inequality, and pollution, we must come together and plan. Governments, business, trade unions, civil society must come together in a coalition to ensure that we move to a form of economic growth that is job-intensive, climate-sound, and can bring about societies for sustainable growth, but that it must be a just transition. And I think this is a very important factor. We don't just need to ensure that we go into a safe world below 2 degrees Celsius. It has to be a just transition that takes into account the way in which emerging economies and poorer developing countries need to develop. And if they are not enabled to develop with clean technologies, then the pressure will be to use the dirty technologies, use the oil, which so many African countries are now finding, and coal, and then find themselves with infrastructures that are presiding over what we will increasingly see as stranded assets. They may be caught in that infrastructure warp if we are not prepared to see that there must be a just transition with the transfer of technologies and support for moving more rapidly to renewables. I'm also very struck by what the projects that women are doing in so many places, women NGOs, women at community level, to become more resilient, to organize. There are climate-wise women who deal with their poor communities, like Constance Okellet of northern Uganda, who was shocked at the changes in her village from predictable climate where you went to sow and to harvest, to long periods of drought and flash flooding. And she formed a women's group to help her community to cope. And that's happening over and over again in communities around the world, trying for resilience. There's one project that I learned about 4 or 5 years ago, and I visited some of the organizers in Australia when I was there, and that is the 1 Million Women Project, which recognizes it's women in diverse contexts in Australia who recognized that it's how they live, the choices that they make, and what they do will affect the planet, the climate, and future generations. They recognize that women of the developed world have enormous powers to make a difference. In Australia, women make an estimated 85% of the purchasing decisions that affect household carbon footprints. And so women represent over half of the Australian electorate and are a powerful natural networker and have a huge influence in the consumer market place. So they set a goal of becoming a global movement of women, ushering in a new way of living. And they launched their 1 Million Women Empowerment Program to get women to set targets for reducing their own emissions, for changing their habits, for changing their the way in which their children would view the future, and try to influence. And these are, I think, the the ingredients that are part of why, at a time of huge challenge, there is a value in looking, as is the focus of our discussion, at the innovative possibilities for diversity. It is also something that has been looked at institutionally. As many of you will know, at the UN level, there are the women's empowerment principles that UN Women and the UN Global Compact worked on and promoted in December 2013. Basically a set of principles that offer guidance on how to empower women in the workplace, the marketplace, and the community. And they are the result of a multi-stakeholder consultative process that basically provides a gender lens through which business can analyze current initiatives, benchmarks, and reporting practices. And it's very much informed by real life and business practices. And the principles help companies to tailor existing policies and practices or establish new ones to realize women's empowerment. In many ways, I think they are very useful because, as I said, this has to be worked at. But if anything, they underestimate what we need to focus on, the innovative capacity to harness a potential that's still underused and that has a different approach to leadership. One of the things that I'm very pleased to see is that more and more women who are exercising leadership are exercising it as women. Don't see the need to do it like men, but actually look into their own capacity to be innovative, to think laterally, to strategize, to imagine a different way, and in many ways are fresher and more open about thinking about leadership in this way, partly because they've come relatively more recently into positions of responsibility and leadership, and I've given you a couple of examples. But as I said, the playing field is not an equal one. There still is a lot that needs to be done, and I think that Ceres, because you are so focused on sustainability, can help to link those concepts of sustainability, diversity, innovation, that this is actually the way forward for companies, and that the more successful companies are those that have already made the commitment and have already worked on ensuring that there is a kind of openness of flexibility in practices in the company that encourages the full participation of women and the sustained participation or the coming back into the workplace after periods of leave, whether for care for children, care for family members or other reasons, that there is the possibility of continuing in a work stream that will enable the full potential to be realized. So I have a project with my foundation and UN Women related to the summit in September that the Secretary General has called to try to increase the political and business and civil society responsibility and response to the threat of climate change. We're focusing on women's leadership, and we'll have a 3.5-hour meeting on the afternoon of the 22nd of September in New York, just before the climate summit, where we hope to get the women political leaders, business leaders, community leaders, faith-based, to actually say, you know, in the 21st century, this is the biggest challenge. Women have to, in fact, give leadership on this. Women probably are more inclined to think of the intergenerational dimensions of it, the intergenerational injustice. As I said, grandchildren can be a hazard, as I learned on Easter Sunday. Grandchildren, for me, are also a constant reminder that we have to think of the generations to come, and we have to think of what kind of world they're going to have and what they will say about us if we don't live up to the unique time. 1944, 1945, they did it. 2014, 2015, we have to do it. That's the key message, and we need business to be rooting for that. Thank you very much.